Hello, everyone. It's Professor Buzzkill, your favorite history professor who busts myths, takes names, and tries to not only learn about new things in history, but present these new things to you. Unfortunately, I'm able to do that because there are so many great scholars out there producing new work that is genuinely groundbreaking. And we have one of those people with us, Dr. Rachel Mesch, whose new book, now out in paperback for you, Before Trans. 3 gender stories from 19th century France. Professor, thanks for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure.
So many things just opened my eyes about this book, but one of them was how interesting these 3 individual stories are in their time. You spend a lot of time in the book talking about, of course, and it's very important about how this is important for gender studies and studies of sexuality and studies of transitioning and all sorts of things. And all that is gripping, but their actual day-to-day lives were fascinating. So do you mind if we do a sort of 3-layered cake version of the show and just talk about each of these 3 individuals one after another? I mean, after all, first of all, it's 19th century France, one of my favorite periods. I sometimes wish I lived in 19th century France. And second of all, these are just glittering stories that tell us so much about not only the period, but about these larger gender questions that you've asked in the book. So is that all right with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was part of what attracted me or sort of shaped the project is that they were each so interesting and so different, living in the same time period, but experimenting with their gender in different ways.
Well, let's start off with the archaeologist. First of all, your pronunciation of these names are going to be much better than mine, so I'll leave that to you.
Okay, yes, absolutely. So Jane Dieulafoy, it's a tricky one and it's a big name. So their name originally their name at birth was Jeanne, the French name, and they then took on the English spelling of it, Jane. So I tend to call them Jane, but Dieulafoy is like Dieu as in God, and La
Hmm.
foi in French is also means faith. So it's a really interesting name that was their God-given name, where they married Marcel Dieulafoy. Actually, they were married. All 3 of the people that I write about were assigned female at birth in sort of heteronormative appearing marriages to men, and even so, kind of left us all of this information about their deep and abiding identification with masculinity, and all 3 of which dressed or of whom dressed in men's clothing for
Hmm.
a good period of their lives.
So what does Jane do? Well, first of all, let's get the Indiana Jones stuff out of the way first
Absolutely.
because it's just fascinating.
Yeah, I'm glad you're appreciating the kind of cinematic possibilities here.
Yeah, yeah.
It's still there. The rights to this film are still out there if anyone's interested, because it is really just a fascinating story. You'll see that I kind of go back and forth between she and they pronouns. The book is written with
Mm,
she, her pronouns. When I was writing it, the use of they in kind of a historical context hadn't really become a thing yet. And I sort of had to convince people of what it was that I was trying to demonstrate, because all 3 of these figures were often only known through kind of feminist histories. And so everyone would just
mhm.
sort of see them as, oh, they're feminists, that, oh yeah, they're wearing pants because they want to kind of seize the power of the patriarchy, which isn't totally not true. But because I was first and foremost a scholar of women's history in 19th century France, I recognized right away that something very different was going on with these 3 figures that separated them from the other women that I had studied. And so once I started to dig in, and it happened to coincide with sort of the transgender moment that we were experiencing in the 21st century, things just sort of started to shift for me. And I understood that all the contradictions of trying to understand these people through a feminist lens were from the fact that none of them really identified with femininity or with the category of women.
Mm.
And that meant different things for each of them. But to start with Jane Dieulafoy, she's, first of all, I kind of am more inclined to use she with Dieulafoy, because as much as I kind of don't want to choose on their behalf what pronouns they would use, Dieulafoy was a conservative Catholic who had a very auspicious marriage to Marcel, who seems to really have understood them deeply. And they were just really a dynamic duo partnership. And so one of the things that happens very early on, well, first of all, they get married and the Franco-Prussian War breaks out. So Marcel is sort of called into the war, and Jane follows. Not just in the role that many women took on during that time, which was, or not that many women, but some women took on, which was sort of a more Florence Nightingale kind of thing. What Jane does is become a sharpshooter and fully
Yeah.
participates in the war. So this is a really defining experience for them. And there's a painting that appears at the time that sort of records this version of herself. And then we sort of don't know that much about the next 10 years or so, but Marcel is an engineer, architecture aficionado, scholar, sort of combination of those things that was possible in 19th century France. And he's interested in exploring and studying Middle Eastern architecture, to sort of try to link this architecture to European architecture. He has these theories about it. And so he organizes an expedition to the Middle East, to the Near East. Yeah. Jane goes with him. And this is when she begins to wear pants again, as she had done during the Franco-Prussian War. And so what we have from this time period, the records that I drew on the archives were two things. One is that she wrote travelogues that were published in a new travel magazine called Le Tour du Monde, in which famous explorers would write about their travels. And, you have to remember during this time, right, people couldn't go to all these places. And so the closest they came was to read these accounts, which were often really kind of nail biters, and to see the photographs that would accompany them. So it's also the invention of photography. And so it's a really important period in the mass press that makes possible this history and also makes possible sort of the endeavors that they were engaged in. Jane learns to be a photographer, learns how to take pictures, and she goes on the trip to sort of be the journalist, keep logs of what's happening, and take photos. But very quickly, as they make their way to Persia, which is modern day Iran, the roads are not paved, and it's just a really kind of very dangerous expedition. They get sick numerous times. And she ends up just really being a part of this mission. And I think, based on what we see of the travelogues, really kind of understanding themselves better through this process. So they actually end up making two expeditions. They come back because they're really ill and it's extremely dangerous. And they come back and they win the support of the Louvre and the French government, which facilitates this whole project. And so they're really full on French Orientalists, which is something that is hard to compare to anything that we have today. But it was really kind of a symbol of national pride to go on these expeditions in the name of France and bring things back, as problematic as that is today, to fill French museums with these things and to succeed in getting to these Persian sites where other European explorers had tried and failed. In particular, the English explorer Loftus had tried and hadn't made it as far as they did. So they actually succeed. And it's there in the travelogues at that moment in around 1884 where they start excavating these palaces that are now on display, not the full palaces, of course, but friezes from these monuments that they excavated are now on display in the Louvre. You can visit them actually in what was at the time known as the Dieulafoy rooms. You can still see those little placards there. These names are actually lost to French history more or less as well, or at least not household names in the way that they were in the 1880s. And so it's those moments in these travelogues that are hundreds and hundreds of pages that are detailed architectural descriptions and all kinds of things that you kind of see Jane find their own voice and embrace their own heroism. And you see that wearing pants, although in the travelogues they explain, well, women in Persia weren't allowed to go unveiled. And so therefore, I had to wear pants.
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
the logic. So there are these kind of interesting I call them strategic pivots that you see in the writing where Jane sort of takes you to the question that you're wondering, which is sort of, how did this work? Aren't you a woman? What are you wearing? How does this work out? And makes you think that she's answering the question, but really she's just kind of sidestepping it and giving you some other delicious piece of information. And so you're like, okay, that makes sense, I guess, that because Persian women had to wear veils, you had to dress like a French man. And that, of course, doesn't explain why then they continued to dress like a French man when they returned. And that didn't mean wearing the kind of whatever kind of pants and casual athleisure of the 19th century for traveling in dangerous circumstances. When they're back in France and they become celebrated for bringing back these architectural wonders to the Louvre, they dress in beautifully tailored men's suits that tend to match very well with their husband, Marcel.
Now, you interestingly point out early on in the book, you need permission from the government to do this. You need a specific permit,
Yes, to
a
wear
woman
pants.
to wear men's pants. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's tell the buzzkillers what the name of that law is or the permit is, because it's in
Sure.
many ways hilarious, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, so it was called a permission de travestissement, literally, right? The transvestite permit, you might say. Travestissement means cross-dressing in French, and it's the sort of the same root as travesty, travestir, c'est travestir in French. And so you needed this permit to wear pants in the 19th century. Starting in the early 19th century, this law was in place. And in fact, the archives have been mostly lost. So we don't have the full record of who had these permits, but we do have sort of bits and pieces. And, technically you would have to have permission from a medical professional in order to have this document, and you could be stopped by the police otherwise and arrested if you didn't have a pants permit. It was a major thing to do, and it wasn't something that women were doing in droves at all at this time period. So the interesting thing about this particular moment, which is the end of the 19th century, really, so this is the 1880s, it's the period that is alternately called the fin de siècle. Sorry for all my fancy French words here, but what's a history podcast if you're not good French words,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and considered one of the high points of fashion and culture, and Paris is sort of the center of the cultural world, very dynamic.
Yeah, it's a period, exactly. It's a period of great social change, alternately called the fin de siècle or the Belle Époque. And you're really sort of the Belle Époque is sort of emphasizing the period from 1900 to 1914. Fin de siècle is sort of like leading right up to 1900. It's sort of the yin and yang of that time period, but it's really the book kind of covers both parts of that. And so absolutely, you'll get starting in the early 1900s, a little bit further on and more towards after World War I, women wearing pants more and more as a feminist statement, as a fashion trend. And so that shift is going to happen, but we're right before that. We're really just before that becomes a thing. And so it's sort of it's really a moment of transition. And these three figures are really kind of working out and pushing the boundaries. And it's still very much a culture where the difference between men and women is celebrated in fashion and otherwise. And so it is a big deal for a woman to wear pants. And so it's not a feminist trend really that takes off, because even French feminism in general is going to be associated. That's my previous book, actually. It's going to be associated with harmonizing femininity and feminism. So for Dieulafoy and Rachilde and Montifaud, the two other subjects of my book, to do this is really something that they're doing kind of out on their own. And they're doing it, my research showed, really of personal necessity, of really, that was clear to me that it was an expression of something very much internal, especially for Dieulafoy, who was extremely conservative, as much as they were a champion for of women's rights, although their main issue was women in combat, interestingly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It was clearly just a very personal interpretation of what that meant and what it meant to be a woman. And she would often kind of write about, well, women aren't what they used to be back when they were ruling queens and leaders in these previous times, and they were fighting in armies and things like that. So she had these very specific definitions and historical examples of what true womanhood meant.
Well, one of the many things that's so interesting about this case is that it isn't just wearing of pants or trousers or whatever you want to call them. Dieulafoy, dresses up, so to speak, almost all the time. So fashion seems to be very, very prominent in their consciousness and in their own self-construction. This isn't wearing overalls just because they're more comfortable. She's making a fashion statement in
Correct.
all kinds of different ways.
Absolutely. And that is really clear, right? I mean, that Dieulafoy would say to people who asked, or to reporters who asked, because they often were in the press, well, it's just more comfortable. And this is what I got used to in Persia. And I just think it's interesting because she's not at all wearing the clothing that she wore in Persia, right? There are many images in the book, by the way.
Mm.
So it's about 60 images. And so that's part of what makes the story so compelling and interesting to tell. You can really see through the photos and through the way that she looks at the camera, even the pleasure that's taken in dressing in this way. And you can also see the difference between the clothing worn in Persia and the clothing worn in daily life in Paris at the turn of the 19th century. So absolutely, it's something we know about from people who are exploring their gender identity and how much your clothing is the way you externalize that and make that visible so that people are seeing you to some extent the way that you want to be seen.
And what sort of commentary do we have about her from other people in Paris at the time? I mean, we can talk about her self-presentation and all that sort of thing, and technically she has this permit.
Right.
But what are other people saying about her? Because she's in the the most, if you will, not maybe not highbrow aristocratic circles, but certainly in the lit crit and all the intellectual circles.
Absolutely. She's actually in a kind of academic elite milieu, and her husband, Marcel, will be elected to the Académie Française. So that's
Hmm.
basically the highest, most conservative honor that you could possibly have. And when you're elected to the Académie Française, you become what is called an immortal. That is sort of as serious as it is. And women at the time had not yet been elected to the Académie Française. They would actually not be elected until 1980 something. So it's very interesting. And that also means that the Dieulafoy archives are located at the Institute of the Académie Française. So there's just this interesting piece where they're actually ultra conservative, and this kind of gender exploration obviously doesn't fit into that. So in terms of how they were seen, because they were part of this elite milieu, because they had done something that was so special, right? Bringing back Persian architecture,
Hmm.
artifacts to the Louvre. It's really hard to compare, but they had this kind of protected status, right? So they were kind of untouchable. And they become Dieulafoy. Jane Dieulafoy, is a sort of an exception and is sort of known as Madame Dieulafoy, the intrepid explorer, eccentric, has their own sort of way of being, but very little criticism. You would see kind of cartoons occasionally making fun of the clothing, sort of
Hmm.
quizzically, but there's an interesting thing that happens because, of course, the word transgender doesn't exist. We have all kinds of other words, and you could make fun of lesbians in the 19th century if you wanted to be homophobic. You could call women hysterics. There were all kinds of other circulating, misogynist and other kinds of terms.
Hmm.
But this particular thing didn't yet exist in medicine so as to be stigmatized. So the target was always going to sort of miss it. It could see it maybe that Jodaffa was a feminist and we could sort of make fun of them that way. But instead, what we find is that, first of all, they were extremely charming. So all the interviews are just people kind of go in guns a-blazing or having all kinds of questions, and they end up saying, this is a very charming woman. She has kind of a feminine voice. She's brilliant. This is how she dressed. And they use a plethora of adjectives, right? They're just sort of paragraphs upon paragraphs describing her. So there's not a word to use. There's not a shorthand. And as a result, along with the photography, you get these really detailed descriptions. And so you see how that stigma is blinding, right? Once there's a label, we stop seeing as well. And because there wasn't one, we have these elaborate descriptions of Dieulafoy
Oh, I
and the
see.
others as well.
Okay. Well, that's a good segue to move on to your second case study.
Sure. So the second one is Rachilde, a little easier to pronounce. They went by the name Rachilde. The birth name was Marguerite Emery. They gave themselves this name, actually, interestingly. So it's a kind of Madonna or Prince, actually, is
Hmm.
perhaps the more
Hmm.
apt
Hmm.
metaphor, because if you kind of think about the gender of Prince, right, it's also unnamed, but when we look back, we sort of see something more complicated going on. Rachilde's grandparents, maternal grandparents, were what was called Spiritists. It was a kind of neo-religion in the 19th century that was actually like kind of strangely mainstream, that involved being able to commune with people from different time periods, to commune with the dead. So Rachilde ends up holding a seance at her home for the benefit of her parents and grandparents, in which she professes to commune or performs this kind of communing with a 17th century nobleman rather, named Rachilde. And this nobleman starts telling stories through the 16-year-old. She's an adolescent at the time, Marguerite. And, she kind of makes it seem as if Rachilde is telling these scandalous stories through the teenage voice. And everyone falls for it, including her mother, especially, who was a believer as well. And then about a year later, Rachilde is now publishing stories in the newspaper under different names, and which her father reads out loud, but like doesn't realize he's reading it to the
Mm.
author and censors
Hmm.
accordingly for teenage ears. But about a year later, Rachilde tells her mother, no, this is me, I'm Rachilde. I made that whole thing up. And her mother doesn't believe her. Her mother says, well, how do you know? How do you know that that's actually how do you know that that you're actually not being, a dead person isn't actually channeling your voice? But she tells us in her memoirs much later on that this was a way, she obviously doesn't use the word coming out, but says this is a way to introduce this voice to my family who would otherwise not have allowed me this freedom. So it is a kind of coming out, and this new name, which sticks eventually once Rachilde moves to Paris and starts publishing, is assimilated with her earlier identity. And so she no longer goes by Marguerite. And she goes to Paris. She's sort of a starving artist, starts wearing pants and cuts off her hair, wearing bigger shoes, and writes a novel that's called Monsieur Venus. So Mr. Venus, but it's even in the English translation, which is pretty widely available, it's called Monsieur Venus. It's a very sort of scandalous, decadent, it's part of the decadent literary movement, whose objective was partly to shock, often scenes with sexuality, very eroticized, as well as drug use and things like that. It was sort of part of trying to achieve a higher level of being or new sensations as the century came to a close, or sort of the sense there's nothing new. So we have to kind of invent new
Hmm.
vices. And this novel is unexpectedly scandalous. Rachilde always says, oh, I just kind of wrote this. I was desperate. I knew that you could publish things in Belgium that would pay for pornography. And so I just wrote this in a kind of fugue state over a couple of weeks. And then it becomes a veritable succès de scandale. And everyone wants to get a copy of it,
Mm.
even though it's censored in Belgium, but she's in Paris, so that's fine.
Well, and we should say that she's I think convicted,
Yeah. In
in absentia in Brussels.
Yes, but remains
So
in
she
Paris.
can't go there. Yeah, but
No.
she stays in
Yes.
Paris and avoids it.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Then sort of the laws change in Paris, so it's easier to publish things that were previously might be subject to censorship in the 1880s. And so a few years later, there's a new edition that gets published, and she becomes kind of that's when the real Succès de Scandale comes out, and there's a whole mystique about it. And so she's always been interpreted as this kind of feminist before her time, this kind of radical sexuality, but also full of contradiction. And so that's actually, of the three people that I write about, the most among literary scholars, the one who is known to literary scholars, although not widely known, beyond that, even in France, is Rachilde, because of the feminist movement, and especially women and gender studies in the United States, there was a rediscovery, particularly of this novel. But it was always analyzed as being just full of contradiction, and you couldn't really pin down the feminism of it, although many people tried, including me, in my
Mhm.
dissertation. I mean, I've been trying to understand this novel for a really long time. And then when I started so I'm a cisgender heterosexual woman writing about this topic who happens to be a scholar, as I said, of women writers of this time. And so I think it would be probably much more, there's plenty of trans readers that would pick up this book and understand probably more quickly what it took me a while to understand, but it really wasn't part of my education, even as a scholar of gender studies, until recently. Kind of the transgender studies is a very new field. So I had been sort of educating myself, reading a lot of trans memoirs in the past 10 years or so. And that's when I kind of returned to this novel and said, wait a minute, this is not actually contradictory. This is someone exploring the contradiction that is being gender dysphoric, feeling at odds with the gender assigned to you in a time period where there's no way to name that. And so
Yeah.
the only thing you're sort of left to think for someone like Rachilde, who was reading a lot of the medical literature at the time, was that I must be mentally ill. I must
Mm.
be hysteric, because that was sort of the available language. And you see that in the novel itself, kind of playing with the idea of hysteria, while there's a kind of extra layer that's undermining that at the same time. And really, the thing is, the book started with those two examples, this hyper-conservative writer, who also wrote novels, by the way. I didn't mention that about Dieulafoy, but they also wrote novels. They wrote a novel, they were not well received,
Hmm.
wrote historical novels. But embedded in the historical novel, this is also what turned me on to the research, is that there are stories, there are two novels that Jane Dieulafoy wrote about people assigned female who become men, who dress either one takes place during is a Joan of Arc story, actually, just a kind of rewriting of the Joan of Arc story. The other takes place during the French Revolution. And the character has this kind of long transformation. It's not just, oh, I need to disguise myself, but actually there's a whole kind of convoluted plot device in each one that means that that character has to become a man, more or less, and yet still
Yeah.
be in a romantic partnership with a man. So very similar to Dieulafoy's own life and to Rachilde's own life. And so what was so striking to me was that the story that Dieulafoy told in this very dry, very historical way was actually at its core the same story that Rachilde was telling in her decadent, very kind of scandalous, embracing the scandal of it all way. They're actually a
Hmm.
similar story of somebody transitioning to a different gender. And that was what was so interesting to me initially, that these two very different people kind of latched on to different narratives that were circulating in their society, but in different milieu in the same time and place. And they also kind of knew each other, knew of each other. And there's these kind of oblique references because they would very much not want to be affiliated with one another. They were so kind of different in every other way.
Well, that then brings us to your third case study. In fact, maybe the most complex of the three, although all three of them are very complex.
The third one is Marc de Montifaud, and that, of course, is a name they gave themselves. Their first name was Marie, and Marie-Amélie Chartreux de Montifaud is a long name. They also married and had a son whom they named Marc, and then they sort of named themselves after their son, Marc. So it's very confusing in the archives at first. I would be very excited thinking I found
Oh, yeah,
from the
yeah, yeah.
original Marc, and then I realized actually the son has really preserved the archives. So, but he has his own writing. So it was super interesting. So Marc Montifaud was an art critic, and they signed everything, which obviously, like, just to have that role was very rare at the time for a woman, for someone who was female presenting, a woman for all practical purposes. Marc de Montifaud obviously was also married, but so she takes on this role as an art critic, and in her art criticism, which there are probably still a lot of citations that don't realize that Marc de Montifaud was a man, because was a woman, or was assigned female at birth, because they're actually a very legitimate art critic who wrote for a very well-known art journal, and art historians kind of just cite them as just in scholarship without before recent research that pays attention to who this person was. But Marc de Montifaud, in their art criticism, they write with a distinctly male voice, in the sense that they go out of their way to refer to themselves as a man, and to gender themselves as male, and to put their own sort of I into the I of, like, the je, I, first person storytelling in ways that are just not necessary for a work of art criticism. So you can see them kind of taking pleasure in playing this role, or in being seen as this role. And so you see in Marc de Montifaud's writing how the writing itself was a way of living their true gender. And they are very interesting. So they then start writing these kind of rewritings of Christian histories, the story of Mary Magdalene, the story of these various nuns, stories of religious figures from the past. And they write them in very salacious ways that people don't appreciate, or there's a group of people who kind of latch onto this and are very disturbed by Montifaud's writing, including their novel writing. They start writing novels that are basically soft porn. And the soft part for the 19th century was borderline, not even that, quite sexual, in which, again, their narrative voice is masculine. And you can see them sort of playing out these sexual fantasies of playing the man through their narrator. But we don't know exactly what happened, but my theory is that Montifaud was already dressing as a man in certain circles, and especially as an art critic, I think that they were dressing in men's clothing. In the book, I have one of the passes that they used to go into this Parisian salons to review the art, the Impressionist art. Part of the reason they're known is because they reviewed Manet's Olympia, and other early Impressionist or Modernist art. And we see that card that just says Monsieur, like Mr. Marc de Montifaud. And so my thought is that likely they were dressing in men's clothing to go to the salons and they wouldn't have been noticed. You can see from the photos in the book that they're very compelling as a man in their masculine identity and they could pass easily. And so it seems to me that they passed and that they undoubtedly took pleasure in doing that to write their reviews. And it would be much easier actually to go in to be the art critic as a man than it would to have to explain that, no, I'm Madame Marc de Montifaud, because that was the name that they were known for. Or they would get invited, right? There's an invitation in the archives for Manet, for one of Manet's openings that was for Marc de Montifaud. And one assumes people didn't know at that point who Marc de Montifaud was. But eventually some people do find out and they're not happy about it. They're not happy that Marc de Montifaud is not the person they were envisioning. And so I think that's what leads to them being taken to court multiple times. So unlike Rachilde, unlike Rachilde, they are actually in the wrong country at the wrong time. And they are sentenced to prison again and again. And they end up having to negotiate different deals or fleeing to Belgium and to Italy. And eventually, the people who are the prosecutors are saying, and there's a lot of articles in the newspaper about this as well, who are kind of commenting like, well, just stop writing these and you'll stop getting sentenced to jail. So you see that it's almost, there's a kind of defiance to Marc de Montifaud, and that's where their personality was also distinct, where they were pissed off about it. They were not going to stop. And they also sort of felt, I wonder if it was some sort of compulsion. This was the way that they enacted their gender transition. And I think the turning point happens when it's a whole other story where the editor of Le Figaro, still an important publication in France to this day, right, writes a piece, a thinly veiled roman à clé, true story, fiction, fiction that's about a woman writer who writes salacious novels. And it's very clear that the story is about Montifaud. And Montifaud and her husband, who was very devoted, as all these pairs were to each other, was absolutely outraged. So Montifaud goes in full masculine attire to the Comédie Française, where she knows the editor and the writer, or the editor, is going to be there, with the newspaper in hand, and accosts this man and slaps him famously with this newspaper, which ends up, you can follow this all kind of in the archives of the newspapers where this is recounted. And it's also a moment where the journalists start saying, don't we have a law against this? The pants wearing part. And there's a kind of resurgence of enforcing this law. But anyway, Montifaud slaps the guy and tells the story in another one of her publications, just with such pleasure of how they slapped him. And then she's like, okay, got to go to exile again, because obviously just the editor of the Figaro and I'm wearing men's clothing. But it's sort of this last moment where it's also a kind of coming out, because it's the first time that they appear in men's clothing in public. And she explains, I'm wearing this like white bow tie because that's what you wear to the Comédie Française. Like, I was wearing the appropriate men's clothing. Again, it was one of these pivots where it was like, I'm going to explain why I'm wearing men's clothing. And instead of explaining that, they explained that they're wearing they like to wear the appropriate men's clothing for certain times of day and events and things like that, because it was still a time where, you had to wear the right thing at the right time, as opposed to explaining why they were identifying with masculinity dressing in men's clothing. But after that, there's a kind of calming down where people stop pursuing her. I think it's sort of the laws are a little freer at this point. And I think that Montifaud also kind of relaxes into the fullest expression of her gender identity. And you can really track that in the photos that I have in the book, where you see an early photo where Montifaud is still wearing a dress and looks unbelievably unhappy and uncomfortable. And then you kind of see the delight in these photos of as they become more and more comfortable and able to present in fully masculine attire. Actually, Montifaud and Dieulafoy were often mistaken for each other, because they both wore similar, well-tailored men's suits, whereas Rachilde was kind of more eclectic in the way that they dressed over time. So you often get people mistaking one for the other. And if you look at the photos, you can sort of see how that might happen.
So, Professor, we learned so much about not only their lives, but we learned so much about what's going on around them. I mean, we've talked about you can't be in certain countries, you'll get arrested or whatever. After doing a deep dive into these three individuals, what do you think this tells us about their, sorry to use the cliche, but time and place?
Well, part of the reason that I love studying 19th century France, and particularly this time, the second half of the 19th century, is that it's the age of mass culture. And it's very similar. It's when all of the things that the forms of entertainment that define our lives, they're all kind of invented and anticipated in 19th century Paris. That's my, that's sort of my, and you can see that all playing out here. This is a story that's about mass culture. It's about ideas circulating in society and how we relate to them. So part of what's going on in the late 19th century in the mass press, which is exploding at the time, and there's a million different newspapers and different publications, and also with photography, and also with the novel and all of this kind of new media, you see different ideas about gender circulating. And part of how individuals understand themselves to this day, right, is through the stories that are told about us. It's by watching TV, we identify with films, with movies, with but the modern media gives us so much more kind of immediate ways to do that. And so one of the things that fascinated me as someone who started as a literary scholar, and it is a very literary work, but I've become much more historical and much more tuned into visual culture through this time period, is the way that these three figures were looking at the culture around them and the stories being told about gender around them and trying to understand themselves through them. And so it's at once very much about what those specific stories were in 19th century France and how many of them there were. If you think about maybe authors you've heard of like Zola and Flaubert, Madame Bovary, right? These are there are always these kind of astonishing female characters doing incredible things at the heart of these stories. And so these writers are looking to those stories and asking, where do I fit in? Where do these stories resonate? And what other stories do I need to tell in order to understand myself? And you see that back and forth. That's about how we create art, but it's also just about humans and how we understand ourselves in this modern day and age. And it's, of course, also about trans and gender history, because long before, as this book shows, long before we had the language to talk about these things in the detailed and complex ways that we do now, people were still experiencing their gender in complex ways. And so we can use that modern lens that we've so developed over the past several years without applying it sort of the way those labels do and art can be blinding, can use it as a lens rather than a label that allows us to perceive the ways in which these figures were asking similar questions, even if their language was very different.
Well, I can't express enough how compelling the book is. The illustrations, as you rightly point out, are central. Thank goodness there are a lot of them, and the publisher allowed you to have a lot of them, because nowadays often they really restrict you. So, Buzzkillers, you must go get this book. Please read it, and not only try to help you understand one of my favorite periods and places in history, but I'll understand how all of these things change so much. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much, Professor, for coming on the show.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
And we will talk to all the rest of you out there next week.